The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical drone as Katie Morrison moved through Mercy General's cardiac unit with the kind of invisibility that came from years of making herself small. She checked the monitor on bed for sinus rhythm, steady, and adjusted the four-drip without a word, her movements economical as a weapons drill. The other nurses didn't look up when she passed. Dr. Hargrove stood near the nursing station in conversation with two cardiologists, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone accustomed to being the loudest person in every room. Katie's name didn't surface in their discussion. They called her the new one. They called her that even though she had worked Mercy General's cardiac unit for 3 years, even though her charting was immaculate, even though patients stabilized under her hands with a consistency the unit supervisor had quietly noted in performance reviews before Dr. Hargrove made it clear such observations were not welcome. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around an elderly woman's arm and waited for the reading. 142/88. Elevated but stable. The woman, Mrs. Chen, smiled at her and asked if she'd been a nurse long. Katie hesitated, that question always created a small fracture in her chest, and said only, long enough. The truth lived elsewhere, buried and deliberate. Long enough meant 12 years in a different life, 3 tours in Kandahar, 2 Purple Hearts folded in a storage unit 5 states away in a city she no longer lived in. Long enough meant watching people die in ways that medical school never prepared you for, and then coming home to a husband who waited in a hospital bed instead, cancer metastasized to stage 4 before they caught it. Long enough meant she couldn't tell her own son where she'd disappeared to the year after the funeral, just that she needed to heal and would be back. She'd been back. She was still healing. Katie finished the vital signs and moved toward the break room, her scrubs whisper quiet against the pressurized silence of the cardiac unit. The coffee maker hissed when she poured, the sound like air escaping a decompression chamber. She sat at the corner table with a magazine she didn't read, her fingers wrapped around a mug that had cooled to the temperature of neglect. The trembling started then, the way it always did in still moments. Her hands shook as if they belonged to someone else, as if the muscle memory of field medicine and emergency resuscitation had lodged itself somewhere deeper than consciousness and refused to release her. She gripped the mug tighter, willing the tremor to stop, watching her knuckles pale with the effort of restraint. The break room door opened. 2 nurses from the pediatric unit entered, chatting about weekend plans. They saw Katie. Their conversation stopped mid-sentence. One of them nudged the other, not unkind, just the social mathematics of hierarchy. Katie wasn't part of their circle. Katie kept to herself. Katie answered questions in monosyllables and didn't participate in the potlucks or the unit gossip or the careful social obligations that bound hospital staff together. One of them poured coffee. The other pulled a chair to the opposite end of the table, as far from Katie as the geometry of the room allowed. They resumed talking, voices slightly louder, filling the space where inclusion had been moments before. Katie pulled her sleeves down, covering the rope burn scars that ran from wrist to forearm. Old damage. Classified damage. The kind of scar that raised questions she couldn't answer. The kind of physical evidence that proved something had happened to her body in service of something she no longer discussed. The scars were pale now, nearly invisible, but in the fluorescent light they caught and she could see the other nurses tracking the movement of her hands. She tucked her hands beneath the table and waited until they finished their coffee and left, waited until the break room was empty again before she allowed herself to breathe normally. At 2:15 p.m., Katie inventoried the crash cart in the medication room, each movement practiced and precise. The crash cart lived on the cardiac unit because cardiac arrest didn't wait for convenience. She opened the drawer containing the emergency equipment and found the pericardiocentesis kit nested in its designated space, a sterile needle, a syringe, the apparatus for drawing fluid from around the heart in the exact moment when the heart itself was being crushed under pressure. She'd used one before. She'd used one in darkness, with a flashlight held between her teeth and a young Marine's chest rising and falling like a desperate question. She'd used one when there was no other choice and no time and no mercy from circumstance. Her hands trembled as she logged the equipment, signed the inventory sheet, and closed the drawer. The trembling was worse now, visible in the reflection of the stainless steel. She gripped the edge of the medication cart until her knuckles blanched, waiting for her nervous system to remember that she was safe, that the emergency had passed 17 years ago, that her body had earned the right to stillness. She thought of the grave in the cemetery across the river, where she visited on rainy afternoons because grief seemed less obvious when it was indistinguishable from weather. Her husband's headstone read his name and his dates and nothing else, because she hadn't known what words could possibly explain the absence. She went there sometimes and stood in the wet grass and told him things she couldn't tell anyone else. She went there and felt like a failure, like a soldier who had survived when she had no right to, like a wife who had failed to save the one person it actually mattered to save. She went there and reminded herself that she had left the Navy so that she could be present for him, and she had arrived home exactly 3 weeks too late. The shift supervisor's voice crackled across the unit radio at 3:44 p.m. Code incoming. Trauma Bay 1. ETA for minutes. Deaf male, age 38, shrapnel wounds to anterior chest, unilateral pneumothorax. Hearing aids inoperative. Recommend deaf services liaison for communication. Katie froze. Her hands were still trembling, but now it wasn't from old memory. It was from something more immediate, something that felt like being called to account for all the choices she'd made to become invisible. A deaf patient. An Army Ranger by the sound of it, given the shrapnel and the deployment mechanism. Kandahar wounds had a particular signature, a particular way of presenting themselves. Shrapnel in the chest wall meant either an IED or small arms fire from close proximity. Either way, it meant combat. It meant someone who had been in the same dust and heat and fear that had shaped her own irreversible decisions. Dr. Hargrove entered the cardiac unit with a kind of entrance that commanded attention through sheer will. He moved past Katie without acknowledging her, his attention already on the incoming patient, already calculating risks and liability and whether this case fell within the scope of Mercy General's capabilities. He pulled together the senior physicians, 2 cardiologists, an orthopedic surgeon with combat experience, a trauma specialist. He didn't include Katie in the briefing, though she stood at the periphery of the nursing station, close enough to hear but not close enough to speak. Deaf and complicated, Dr. Hargrove said to the assembled physicians, his tone suggesting the first fact was almost more problematic than the second. Communication barriers. Liability issues. Shrapnel in a thoracic cavity is not something I want to navigate without certainty. Not here. Not at Mercy General. One of the cardiologists nodded. We could transfer to Charleston Medical. Level 1 Trauma Center. 20 minutes away, the trauma specialist said. Patient won't make it. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His eyes moved across the unit, landed on Katie for the first time since he'd arrived, dismissed her in the same instant. Katie understood the calculus happening behind his expression. She was a woman. She was small. She was new. She was not the type of nurse a hospital system promoted or listened to. She was competent in the way that made supervisors' lives easier but not memorable. She was the kind of nurse who could pass any certification exam and still be treated like an aide. We'll handle it, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades in positions where he didn't have to be right, only certain. But I'm not taking primary responsibility for communication gaps. That falls on deaf services, not on us. Katie moved toward the trauma bay, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. The rubber snapped against her wrists, a sound like a gun's hammer. She had American Sign Language certification from her Navy days, when she'd served with a Marine from South Carolina who was HOH and needed a linguist with medical vocabulary. She had 12 years of medical experience and 3 tours in hostile territory and hands that knew how to move in crisis. But in this moment, moving through the hallways of Mercy General toward a patient who needed her, she was still invisible. She was still small. She was still just a nurse. The trauma doors were already opening. The trauma doors hissed open and Sergeant Daniel Morrison came through on a gurney, his unconscious body wrapped in bandages like a soldier twice buried. The chart clipped to the bed rail told a story nobody wanted to read. Katie saw it before she saw him, a single page documenting 20 doctors from 3 separate facilities who had already refused treatment. 20. The number sat there in black ink like an indictment. Communication barriers, the chart said. Liability concerns. Shrapnel-riddled chest cavity with suspected cardiac involvement. Complex case. Deaf patient. Each refusal a different reason. Same result. She knew his face before she knew his name. Sergeant Daniel Morrison, Army Ranger, the man who'd carried her son 3 miles through Kandahar's burning streets with a broken femur and insurgent fire cutting the air around them both. The man who'd brought her boy home alive when everyone else had left him for dead. She'd seen photographs her son kept hidden in a journal he didn't know she'd found. Combat boots laced tight. Jaw like granite. Eyes that had seen things most people couldn't survive witnessing, let alone living through. Mercy General's trauma bay filled with controlled chaos, nurses moving with practiced efficiency, the ventilator already hissing its mechanical rhythm as the paramedics transferred him from stretcher to bed. Katie stayed at the periphery where she was supposed to be, watching, waiting, her hand steady even as everything inside her recognized a debt she'd never be able to repay. 20 doctors had turned him away. 20. The number meant something. It meant they were about to learn why that mattered. Dr. Hargrove arrived within minutes, his white coat immaculate, his presence like a physical force that made the air pressure change the moment he walked into a room. He was a man who knew his power and wore it like armor. Chief of Surgery at Mercy General for 18 years. Connected to the hospital board. The kind of physician who made decisions not based on patient outcomes but on institutional liability. He reviewed the chart with Morrison's adult daughter and elderly mother standing at bedside, their faces tightened with fear and exhaustion from the 3-hour drive to Savannah. The mother's hand shook as she signed updates to her son, her fingers moving in the language Morrison had learned to hear with his eyes after an IED took his ears in 2011. Hargrove looked at Katie the way a man looks at a problem he'd already decided to weaponize. "Nurse Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across the trauma bay so every staff member could hear. "I understand you have a personal connection to this patient." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment in water. "How unfortunate that your emotional involvement clouds your judgment about his unsuitability for our facility." The air quotes he made around the word unsuitable could have drawn blood. Katie felt the heat of 20 staff members' eyes pivot toward her. She took one measured breath. Let herself feel the sharp edge of everything, the fluorescent glare, the beeping monitor, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something like fear sweat. She could have responded like the nurse they all thought she was. Apologetic. Deferential. Backing down. Instead, her voice came out steady as stone, and when she spoke, it was a voice that had given orders in hostile territory and had never once been questioned. "Sergeant Morrison deserves the same care you'd give someone who looks like you." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens before something breaks. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His face darkened from the neck up, blood flooding his features like a reaction to poison. He turned to Morrison's family, his voice dropping to a register that managed to be both quieter and more dangerous. "This nurse lacks the qualifications to advocate for specialized care," he announced, air quotes again, each syllable clipped and deliberate. He looked at the gathered staff. "Our little hero here seems to think she understands this patient's needs better than the physicians who've already evaluated him." The nickname hung in the air like something toxic. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Katie Morrison had spent 6 years in the Navy as a senior chief petty officer running combat medical operations in the same region where this ranger's hearing had been stolen by an explosion. That she understood cardiac tamponade not from textbooks but from treating soldiers in forward operating bases where waiting for a specialist meant watching someone die. That her emotional involvement was the only reason Sergeant Morrison was still breathing at all. Hargrove assigned her directly to Morrison's care. Specifically. Deliberately. As a trap. "Since you seem so invested, Nurse Morrison, you'll be his primary. Let's see how your attachment issues translate to clinical decisions." He said it in front of the daughter, in front of the mother, in front of everyone. "Watch her fail," his tone suggested. "We all will." An hour later, Katie sat in the break room with her lunch untouched on the table in front of her. She'd barely settled into the chair when 5 nurses rose in unison, their movements coordinated like they'd rehearsed it. They didn't look at her. They didn't speak. Their chairs scraped backward in deliberate, synchronized noise. The unit secretary smirked from the doorway, watching the exit like she was scoring a play. The message was clear: you don't sit with us. You don't belong here. Katie didn't flinch. She didn't look up from her lunch. She did exactly what she'd been trained to do. She remained motionless, kept her breathing steady, and let her presence become invisible. But her hands, which nobody could see under the table, pressed against the cool laminate of the break room chair, and in that pressure was something like restrained fury. That afternoon, Hargrove posted a formal write-up on the unit board where everyone would see it. Her name in red marker at the top. Formal. Official. A weapon dressed in administrative language. Overstepping scope of practice by questioning physician decisions, it read. Inappropriate emotional attachment compromising clinical judgment. It was the kind of write-up that followed you through a career, the kind that made future employers hesitant, the kind that turned colleagues into strangers. Katie found it when she checked the board for shift assignments. She read every word while standing in the hallway, her face revealing nothing. The words tried to reframe her question as insubordination. Reframe her knowledge as emotion. Reframe the only thing she could do right, advocate for her patient, as a violation of protocol. She took a breath. One single, controlled breath. Then she walked to the medication room and continued her shift as if the write-up didn't exist, as if the smirks didn't matter, as if she hadn't just been publicly executed by someone who had no idea what he was standing next to. That was when Morrison's daughter found her in the hallway outside the patient's room. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her body tight with the particular exhaustion of watching someone you loved disappear into medical machinery. "My father told me about a medic named Morrison in Kandahar," she said quietly. "He said this medic saved his entire unit twice. Are you related to that Morrison?" Katie's hands, the ones that had held lives together in field hospitals and in trauma bays, the ones that had signed requests for help nobody would provide, stilled completely. She couldn't speak. The words were there, trapped behind everything she'd buried about herself, everything she'd hidden under scrubs and invisibility. She shook her head once, a lie made physical, and walked away before her composure could fracture in front of someone who deserved better. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when she returned to Morrison's room and saw what his body was trying to tell her. Morrison's breathing had changed sometime after midnight. Katie noticed it first, not from the monitor, but from the way his chest rose and fell with less authority, like a man climbing stairs instead of walking flat ground. She'd been watching him for 6 hours straight, and the pattern was unmistakable now. Distended neck veins. Blood pressure sliding from 118 down to 104. Heart sounds becoming muffled, as if someone had wrapped his chest in wet gauze. Beck's triad. All 3 signs converging like storm clouds over the same point on a map. She documented it in the chart with clinical precision, each notation a small alarm bell that only she seemed to hear. Pericardial effusion. The fluid was accumulating faster than his body could compensate. The pericardium, that tight fibrous sac surrounding the heart, was filling with blood from the shrapnel wounds, and with each heartbeat, the pressure inside increased. Eventually the pressure would exceed the pressure inside the heart chambers themselves. When that happened, the heart would simply stop pumping. Cardiac tamponade. A death sentence written in milliliters of blood. Katie had seen it before. Not in a hospital. In a compound 30 kilometers south of Kandahar, where a SEAL team lay bleeding in the courtyard while the heat shimmer made everything look like a lie. She'd performed for pericardiocenteses that day under small arms fire, her hand steady as granite because panic was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. Pain was data. Blood was information. Fear was just another vital sign to ignore. But this was different. This was a hospital. This was a system. This was Dr. Hargrove making rounds at 2:17 a.m. and dismissing her concerns with a wave that moved through the air like a blade. "Morrison stable," he'd said, not even glancing at the monitor. Atlanta team arrives at 7. We're not doing anything unauthorized in this hospital. The way he said unauthorized, each syllable like a stone thrown at her feet. A line drawn. A warning. A threat wrapped in professional language. Katie said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was a weapon too. By 4:40 a.m., Morrison's blood pressure had dropped to 92/58. The heart rate climbed to 118, rapid and thready. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy quality, the way skin looks when the body is preparing to shut down its peripheral systems and focus everything on survival. Compensatory tachycardia. The heart working harder to push less blood forward. It was like watching a swimmer realize they were drowning. The thrashing came next. Always the thrashing. She called for a transfer. Gurney to another floor, to the other unit where they might have better monitoring. The protocol required it. The system required it. Katie required it because she could feel the hours running out like sand through fingers, and Atlanta was still 4 hours away, and Morrison's heart was being crushed by fluid that shouldn't be there, and she was the only one in this hospital who understood what that meant. The gurney arrived at 5:03 a.m. 2 orderlies, a resident named Chen who'd been kind to her yesterday, and the attending physician on night shift, Dr. Paulson, who was tall and indifferent in the way that some physicians achieve perfection at being unremarkable. The hallway was empty except for them. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in the color of old teeth. Morrison's monitor beeped its regular rhythm, a sound like machinery counting down to 0. They'd moved 6 feet when his monitor went wild. The beeping became a frantic chirp, high and urgent, the sound of a system recognizing catastrophe. Morrison's back arched off the gurney. His eyes went wide. Katie saw his mouth form words his deafness meant no one heard, a silent scream, pure animal panic, the moment when the body realizes the heart isn't pumping anymore, not really, not enough, and everything is starting to fade into gray. Blood pressure 72/40. Then 68/40. Then 52/30. The numbers falling like dominoes. 02 sat dropping. 92. 88. 84. Get him back to the trauma bay, Katie said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind of voice that came from someone used to being obeyed, used to men's lives hanging on her next instruction. But Paulson stepped back. Chen stepped back. The orderlies stepped back. And Katie understood then why they'd been called to witness her failure, to be present when the system protected itself by doing nothing. We can't move him in arrest, Paulson said, his voice carrying the thin confidence of someone reciting policy while a man died. We need to stabilize him here. He's in tamponade, Katie said. His heart is crushed. We don't stabilize him, we don't move him, he dies. The blood in the pericardium has to come out. That requires a surgeon, Paulson said. That requires authorization. We call Atlanta. Atlanta is 4 hours away and he has for minutes. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the rain outside beginning to pick up, drumming against the hospital's exterior walls, a sound like distant gunfire, like distant anything. Morrison's oxygen saturation dropped to 76. 72. The heart monitor showed a rhythm that was barely a rhythm anymore, more like an echo of beating than actual beats. His daughter had been in the waiting room all night. Katie thought about her daughter screaming for someone to do something. Then Dr. Hargrove appeared at the far end of the hallway like a man materializing from the fluorescent light itself, white coat pristine, face already flushed with something that looked like anticipation. He positioned himself between Katie and the crash cart with the precision of a man who'd blocked doorways before, who understood the geography of power. No one is performing procedures on this patient, Hargrove said. Nobody except Atlanta. That is my instruction. His tamponade is acute, Katie said. Her hands had started moving on their own, already reaching for the emergency kit that hung on the wall 4 feet away. He's in arrest. In 3 minutes his brain starts dying. You are not authorized. Katie moved like water around a stone. She dropped to her knees beside the gurney, muscle memory and training taking over the way it did when thinking slowed everything down. The pericardiocentesis kit was in her hands. The needle glinted under the overhead lights like a small silver promise. She identified the landmarks, the xiphoid process, the angle, the space between the ribs, the same landmarks she'd found in a courtyard outside Kandahar while round snapped past her ears and blood soaked into sand that was older than empires. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle beneath the xiphoid process. She drew back. Dark blood filled the syringe. Not bright. Not arterial. The old blood of pooled effusion, the fluid that had been crushing Morrison's heart into silence. She drew back again. Again. 30 milliliters. 50 milliliters. The heart monitor's rhythm changed. Started climbing. Became something close to organized. Morrison's eyes blinked. His hand moved. The oxygen saturation climbed like something coming back to life. 78, 84, 91, 96. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful, ordered sinus rhythm. The rhythm of a heart that was beating again. The hallway filled with people then. Nurses appearing from rooms. A respiratory therapist. Someone from the night shift pharmacy. They emerged like moths drawn to light, or maybe they'd been watching all along and only moved once it was clear which way the current had turned. Hargrove's face had shifted colors, from red to purple to a kind of marbled white, as if his body couldn't decide which shade of rage best expressed the magnitude of his anger. He pulled out his phone. His fingers moved. 3 calls. Katie heard fragments. Investigation. Unauthorized procedure. Deactivate her credentials. His voice had taken on the thin, dangerous quality of a man whose authority had been dismantled in front of witnesses. Katie's hands were trembling now. Not from the procedure, that clarity, that absolute certainty, had left her as soon as the needle came out. But from what came next. From understanding that she'd just crossed a line that the system had drawn, and there were no line erasers in hospitals, only consequences. Morrison's daughter appeared at the end of the hallway, and Katie's eyes met hers for just a moment, long enough to see gratitude, long enough to see a daughter who understood her father had just been given back to her. Katie signed to her in ASL, her trembling fingers moving with less fluidity than usual, less grace, but the meaning absolute and clear: take care of him. She signed it because Morrison was deaf. She signed it because it was the only way to truly reach the man whose life she'd just saved. And in signing it, she revealed something no one in this hospital had known, that Katie Morrison, the quiet nurse, the nurse who deferred and accepted dismissal and stayed invisible, spoke the language of military rescue operations, the language of the deaf, the language of people who'd been forgotten and had learned to survive anyway. Security arrived at 5:22 a.m. 2 men in uniform, professional and efficient, and Hargrove moved toward them like a man who'd been expecting them, who'd been preparing for this moment since the moment Katie had disobeyed him. He announced it loudly enough for every nurse on the unit to hear, making sure the words became official, became documented, became the story everyone would tell. Katie Morrison is banned from patient care areas pending investigation for performing unauthorized procedures. Her badge is deactivated effective immediately. They took her badge from around her neck. The ID clattered against the tile floor, a small sound, almost insignificant, the sound of a name being erased. Her locker was cleared by a hospital administrator who wouldn't meet her eyes. Her uniform hung in a plastic bag that they handed to her without speaking. Morrison's belongings sat in a clear plastic bin on a table in the hallway. Personal effects, they called them, the small things that proved a man had existed outside of his injuries. Among them were combat boots. Worn. Scuffed. The leather creased in the precise way that comes only from 1,000 marches, 1,000 missions, 1,000 moments of walking toward something terrible and then walking back. Katie's eyes lingered on those boots for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to recognize them. Long enough to understand what they meant. Long enough to know that the man inside those boots had walked toward danger so that people like her could walk away from it. She was escorted out as the sun rose over Savannah, painting the sky the color of a wound that was healing. The parking lot of Mercy General sprawled behind her in the early light, the kind of grey that comes before everything gets worse. Katie sat in her Honda Civic with the engine off, cardboard box on the passenger seat, her belongings wrapped like evidence. The combat boots were still in there, unwrapped now, the newspaper torn. She stared at nothing and breathed the way she'd been trained, in through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 7, out through the mouth for 8. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. In the administrative conference room 3 floors above, Dr. Hargrove had already begun his work. He sat at the oak table with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice smooth as surgical steel. "Board President, I apologize for the hour, but we have a catastrophic liability situation." His words moved with precision, each one a scalpel. He'd been building this network for 22 years, calling in favors like withdrawals from an account that never ran dry. "A nurse on my unit performed an emergency pericardiocentesis in a public hallway without physician oversight, without proper equipment, without proper credentials verification." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "I have documentation. Falsified resume. Behavioral red flags. She's a liability we can't afford to ignore." The board president's voice crackled back, tinny and alarmed. By 6:11 a.m., an external investigation team from the state nursing board was en route. By 7:15, Hargrove had made calls to the nursing school listed on Katie's abbreviated resume, the one that didn't exist before 3 years ago. The woman on the phone, a records coordinator in Maryland, confirmed what he'd expected: no prior employment history. Catherine Morrison had simply appeared in the professional world like she'd materialized fully formed, which meant the official story was a lie, which meant everything else was negotiable in a court of law. He brought in the investigation team personally, walked them to the nursing unit himself, handed them Katie's locker combination like a key to her guilt. "Search everything," he said, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, a massive, patient, absolutely lethal. "I believe you'll find documentation of the unauthorized procedure, possibly falsified credentials, evidence of mental instability." The investigators, 2 women in dark blazers with state seals on their badges, opened locker number 247 at 8:33 a.m. The combat boots sat there, worn Welco military-grade boots, identical to the pair that belonged to Sergeant Daniel Morrison upstairs in the ICU. They held them up, turned them over. "These are military issue," one of them said, not as a question. "She kept them at work," Hargrove said quietly. "Personal items mixed with medical equipment. The kind of boundary dissolution we see in unstable nursing personnel." Katie didn't see the investigators arrive. She was already gone by then, escorted from the building at 8:19 a.m. by security, her badge deactivated before her feet hit the tile, her locker cleared by hospital staff and placed in the cardboard box by 8:13. They gave her severance paperwork, a copy of her termination notice citing gross negligence, unauthorized practice of advanced procedures, falsified employment documentation, and violation of scope of practice standards. Her son received a call at 8:52 a.m. from Morrison's daughter, who'd been watching the surveillance cameras from her father's ICU room. He arrived 4 hours later to a hospital where Katie had already been erased. The rain started in the afternoon, slow at first, then with the kind of persistence that made the sky look bruised. Katie stood at the veteran cemetery in Bonaventure, her shoe sinking slightly into the soft earth, the cardboard box on the ground beside her. The headstone read James Morrison, 1982 to 2018. SEAL Team 6. His name was engraved with the Navy trident below it, the stone already weathered grey by 6 years of Georgia rain. "I had one chance to save the man who saved our boy," Katie whispered, and the words came out hollow, like they were being pulled from a place that had already given up. "And I failed him just like I failed you." The rain mixed with tears on her face. She didn't wipe them away. Her dress uniform was buried in a storage unit in Jacksonville, 73 miles away, packed in a garment bag next to her Navy Cross in its presentation case. When the PTSD from Kandahar had become too much, the nightmares where she was drowning in blood that wasn't water, the panic attacks that lasted 3 hours, the way her hand shook when she heard helicopter rotors, she'd walked away from everything. She'd changed her name slightly on civilian paperwork, Catherine to Katie, swapped her married name with her maiden name, and told no one, not even her son, where the Navy senior chief petty officer had gone. She'd chosen anonymity over decorations, quiet over command, invisibility over the truth. Now both lives were gone. The combat boots lay in the mud at her feet, identical to the pair Morrison had carried in his belongings. She'd understood that only in the moment before they'd walked her out. He'd kept them because of what she'd done in Kandahar, the same reason she'd kept hers. Muscle memory and survival and the weight of people you couldn't save. Her phone rang, her son's number showing on the screen, but she couldn't answer. She couldn't explain. She couldn't be the broken thing that her voice would confirm. The night deepened. The rain didn't stop. Somewhere across Savannah, Morrison lay in an ICU bed with his heart beating steadily, the fluid drained, his daughter at his side showing him surveillance footage on her tablet. Somewhere in an administrative office, Hargrove reviewed Katie's file one more time, making notes, preparing his narrative for the investigation. The story was already written in his mind: unstable nurse, falsified credentials, dangerous hero complex, lucky save, career over. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. The morning light through the hospital windows turned grey as Rahimi wheeled himself toward the exit, blood seeping through the gauze on his shoulder, his eyes tracking the scene ahead. He'd seen that face before, not in photographs, not in intelligence briefings, not in the classified folders stamped with seals that no longer meant anything to him. He'd seen her in the chaos of Kandahar when the convoy ignited and she'd pulled him from the burning metal before his own people would have left him there to die. A woman. Moving like water through fire. Hand steady as surgical steel. He watched the security guard's hand on her elbow now, watched her walk without resistance, and the moment her face turned toward the hallway light, his breath caught. The same scar. The same set to her jaw. Rahimi's voice came out in careful English, each word weighted with years of translation between worlds that should never meet. I know her. The woman from the Kandahar raid who saved 16 soldiers. The entire corridor stopped. The security guard's grip loosened. Katie didn't turn around. She could feel the electricity in the air like the moment before shrapnel finds its target, that split second where everything becomes inevitable. The guard looked at Rahimi, then back at Katie, confusion blooming across his face like a stain spreading through cotton. In that pause, the hospital's institutional weight shifted. Somewhere on the second floor, a phone began to ring. Katie's son had received a call at his barracks in Fort Stewart, 43 minutes north. His mother didn't work with classified information. His mother was a nurse. His mother wore scrubs and came home smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion and spoke about her day in the careful language of someone keeping their life small and deliberate. The Ranger's family had called him anyway because they understood something about loyalty that transcended rank. Morrison had brought the boy home alive, which meant Morrison's family was his family now. When he arrived at Mercy General, his uniform still carried the red Georgia clay from morning PT. He pushed through the boardroom doors without knocking and said it like a soldier making a statement of fact, "She's a senior chief petty officer." The room went dead silent. Morrison was wheeled in on a hospital gurney, his massive frame reduced to muscle and bandages and will, his right ear still draining fluids from the blast that had stolen his hearing but not his purpose. Katie stood against the far wall, still in her scrubs, still in the posture of someone who'd been told to wait. Morrison's eyes found hers across the room and held there for 3 seconds. Then he raised one trembling hand and formed a sign, the manual alphabet, spelling out a question without sound. Katie's hands moved before her mind caught up. They trembled, not with fear, but with the nerve damage from shrapnel still lodged in her back, the kind of trembling that came from 147 surgical fragments the Navy had decided were too close to her spine to remove. Her hands shook as she signed back, her fingers moving through the ASL alphabet with the fluid precision of someone fluent in languages most people never learned existed. Morrison's other hand came up slowly. In his grip were a pair of boots. Desert tan. Worn. Katie recognized them immediately. She'd helped him into those exact boots 6 years ago, before a mission that should have killed him but didn't. Before a medic who was supposed to stay back at base ran toward the burning convoy instead. The boots hit the boardroom table with a sound like a gavel, and everyone in the room understood someone here had lied. The doors opened without knocking. A SEAL team leader entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms without speaking. His uniform carried insignia that made generals straighten their posture, and his presence made the air pressure change, that terrifying quality of absolute competence applied to absolute violence in service of absolute honor. Behind him came Pentagon officials in dark suits carrying folders stamped with classification levels that didn't technically exist on any official registry. The SEAL's voice was steady as a surgical laser. Bronze Star. The room absorbed this. Silver Star. Katie's son made a sound in the back of his throat. 2 Purple Hearts. The SEAL looked directly at Dr. Hargrove, and Hargrove felt his institutional power evaporating like blood on a cooling gurney. And a Navy Cross. For leading a classified rescue operation at Kandahar that saved an entire battalion. 214 Marines. All because Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison ran into a burning compound when every protocol told her to wait outside. All because she decided that 214 soldiers mattered more than her own survival. The Pentagon official moved toward the boardroom table and opened his folder. Hargrove's hands were shaking now, genuine shaking, the kind that comes from understanding you've just assaulted the wrong person. He'd made his fatal calculation believing Katie was powerless. Powerless women didn't have Pentagon escorts. Powerless people didn't have SEAL team leaders verifying their service record. His mind raced, calculating, and in that moment of desperation he made the choice that would cost him everything. He opened his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of someone who'd practiced this exact maneuver dozens of times before, just not with federal agents now monitoring every keystroke. He was altering her personnel file in real time, inserting discharge notes, fabricating medical evaluations, creating documentation that would support his narrative that he'd terminated a mentally unstable employee for patient safety reasons. The document materialized on his screen and he pushed the computer toward the Pentagon official with the gesture of a man who believed institutional power still belonged to him. The FBI agents monitoring the briefing for security purposes moved simultaneously, which is to say they moved like the rotor wash of a Black Hawk clearing a landing zone, sudden, overwhelming, and absolutely final. 2 agents entered from the back, and their movements had the liquid precision of apex predators moving through water. They didn't run. They didn't shout. One agent simply closed the laptop and stepped back while the other read Hargrove his rights in a voice that had delivered those same words 847 times before and would deliver them 847 more times in a career dedicated to people who believed the rules didn't apply to them. The handcuffs went on with a sound like finality, click, click. The kind of sound that echoes. Falsifying federal military documents was a felony. Creating fraudulent discharge records was a felony. Attempting to obstruct justice in a Pentagon investigation was a felony. The math was simple. Hargrove would spend the next 4 to 8 years in a federal facility where his medical credentials wouldn't matter and his institutional power would amount to whatever he could trade in commissary currency. The perp walk happened in the hallway outside the ICU. Nurses who'd abandoned Katie in the break room now lined the corridor watching their chief of surgery move past them in handcuffs, his face the color of old paper, his breathing the only sound aside from the scrape of federal agent shoes on linoleum. Morrison's family stood at the ICU entrance and watched. Katie's son watched from the boardroom threshold, understanding finally why his mother had carried such silence, not weakness, but the discipline of someone who'd already survived the worst the world could offer. In the parking lot, Katie stood alone beside her 12-year-old Honda Civic, and her son found her there because that's what sons do. He embraced her without words, and Katie allowed herself to stand in that embrace for exactly 47 seconds before her training reasserted itself and her posture corrected. That evening, the hospital board issued a formal apology and offered her reinstatement with 847 hours of back pay and a position as director of their new Veterans Care Initiative. But Katie couldn't answer yet. The Pentagon had other plans, and those plans would require her to finally wear her truth out loud. 6 months later, Katie walked through downtown Savannah in her service dress blue uniform. The Navy Cross ribbon gleamed against her chest like sunlight off cold water, and the uniform itself seemed to make the air pressure change as she moved. She passed a strip mall where Dr. Hargrove, stripped of his medical license and awaiting trial for federal document fraud, sold insurance policies from a folding table beneath a banner advertising rates that no one trusted anymore. His medical degrees were boxed in the back of his Lexus. His practice was gone. His career was ash. He didn't look up as Katie passed, but he felt the shadow cross his desk, and in that moment he finally understood what institutional power meant when it wasn't yours anymore. The Pentagon ceremony happened at the John Philip Sousa Band Hall in Washington. Katie stood in uniform beside Sergeant Morrison, who wore his army dress uniform with the medals of a soldier who'd been to places civilians shouldn't have to imagine. Morrison's daughter stood beside them as interpreter, her hands moving through ASL to translate the Secretary of Defense's words for her father, for the room, for history now unclassified and open to light. Morrison signed directly to Katie, and his daughter translated aloud, "Thank you for saving me twice." Katie signed back, her hands no longer trembling with nerve damage but moving with the certainty of someone who'd finally integrated all the pieces of herself she'd been carrying separately. "You brought my son home. We're even." Rahimi, the former Taliban fighter turned U.S. intelligence consultant, attended the ceremony and afterward approached Katie with the kind of respect that transcended nationality. "Courage," he said carefully, "has no flag. Only direction." Katie returned to Mercy General not as a floor nurse but as the director of their Veterans Care Program, her office wall displaying her Navy Cross beside her nursing license, a statement of integrated identity that no one could divide again. The combat boots sat on a shelf in her home, both pairs, hers and Morrison's, a reminder written in worn leather of what it meant to finally stop hiding. The closing shot shows Katie training new nurses in emergency procedures, her voice calm and certain as a surgeon's hand, while the truth settles into the walls of Mercy General like morning light through hospital windows. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.